Harold, 3 years ago, my son David dropped me off at Sunset Manor Nursing Home and said, "Dad, this is for the best. You're too much of a burden for us to handle anymore." He promised to visit every week, but I haven't seen him since. What David doesn't know is that the burden he abandoned owns $3.2 million in assets, and I just changed my will to leave everything to his ex-wife, the woman he cheated on and divorced. Harold, last week, David got a call from my lawyer informing him that his inheritance was going to someone else. The son who thought I was worthless is about to discover that abandoning your father has consequences that last forever. Harold, this is the story of how one cruel decision at a family dinner cost my son everything he thought he'd inherit, and gave it all to the daughter-in-law who actually deserved it. Harold, my name is Harold Mitchell, and I'm 78 years old. For most of my life, I was exactly what people expected me to be, a hard-working electrician who built a modest life for his family. I married my high school sweetheart Ruth, raised 2 children, and thought I'd done everything right. Harold, my son David was always the golden child. Smart, ambitious, good-looking, everything a father could want in a son. He went to college, on a scholarship, became a successful insurance executive, and married a wonderful woman named Lisa, who gave me 2 beautiful grandchildren. Harold, for 30 years, I thought David and I had a good relationship. We'd have Sunday dinners together. I'd babysit the grandkids, and David would ask my advice about work and life. When Ruth died 5 years ago, David was there for me, helping with the funeral arrangements and making sure I was okay. Harold, what David didn't know was that his simple electrician father had been a lot smarter with money than anyone realized. While other guys spent their paychecks on beer and new trucks, I'd been investing in real estate and the stock market since the 1970s. Harold, I owned 4 rental properties, had a substantial investment portfolio, and had saved over $800,000. In cash, my total net worth was around $3.2 million. But I lived modestly in the same house I'd owned for 40 years and drove the same pickup truck for 15 years. Harold, I kept my wealth quiet because I wanted to see who my children really were when they thought I had nothing to offer them. My daughter Sarah, who lived in California, stayed in touch regularly and visited whenever she could. But David was the one who lived nearby, and I assumed he'd be there for me as I aged. Harold, I was wrong. My name is on the mailbox of the same little house it had been on for 4 decades. The shingles a shade grayer, and the maple out front taller than the telephone pole beside it. I wired half the neighborhood when I was young kitchens, but still hum because the circuits were done right the first time. Porches that glow steady through winter because someone cared enough to weatherproof each junction box. I was an electrician by trade and a creature of habit by temperament. A thermos of black coffee at dawn, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper at noon, work boots lined up heel to heel every night by the back door. People thought that predictability meant smallness. It meant steadiness. I married the girl from homeroom who could outrun every boy to the far fence and still tuck a curl behind her ear before the bell rang. Together we learned how to turn 2 paychecks into a life. She ran a home like a captain, runs a ship lists on the fridge, envelopes for the bills, and a pantry that never ran out of beans or good sense. I brought home callous palms in overtime when it was there. Sundays were for church, supper, and the kind of conversation you only earn by listening 6 days out of 7. Money did not talk in our house, it reported. A ledger lived in the junk drawer, pencil sharpened, eraser worn to a nub. Early on, I learned that wages were one thing and ownership another. On lunch breaks, I'd read the business section, not for gossip about men in suits, but for the tide tables of ordinary wealth dividends, reinvestment plans, companies that sold the very wire I ran through studs. I opened my first brokerage account when the counter clerk still wore a visor and looked at me like I was lost. I wasn't. Little by little, I collected shares the way a careful man collects spare screws in a labeled jar. Not exciting, not dramatic. Effective. Real estate. Came next. Not the glossy kind. The kind with listing photos that showed more dandelions than grass, with porches that sagged and furnaces that complained. I knew what a property needed because I could feel it in the bones of the structure, where the service should be upgraded. How many outlets a decent bedroom deserves. Why GFCs in an old kitchen are worth more than granite. We bought a duplex first, lived on one side, rented the other, and let the tenants pay the mortgage while I spent weekends crawling through crawl spaces and learning that sweat equity is just a fancy way to spell patience. Children arrive like bright, whether you plan your whole year around. First a girl who laughed like wind chimes, then a boy who sorted his crayons by color before he could read. We taught them the old rules: say thank you with your eyes as well as your mouth. Take your hat off inside, put tools back where you found them. Their mother taught them to write notes and keep promises. I taught them to coil an extension cord properly and to never brag about a job you haven't finished. The boy grew fast and handsome in the dangerous way that opens doors before you've learned what rooms you actually want to enter. He was quick with numbers and quicker with charm. Teachers said words like gifted, leadership potential, big future. We nodded and saved. Science fairs, saxophone lessons, debate camp opportunities that feel expensive when you write the checks, and cheap when you watch a teenager discover what he can do with a mind that wakes up hungry. Scholarship letters arrived. He sailed off to a campus that looked like a postcard, called on Sundays. Came home at Thanksgiving with new opinions and a suit for the internship he'd landed by audacity. The girl my first headed west later, a spirit built for horizons. Calling as often as distance allows and writing the kind of letters you fold carefully and read again. When the house is quiet, he met the woman who would make me a grandfather. On a day I still remember by the smell of rain on hot concrete. She shook my hand with a grip that meant everything she said, laughed at my jokes, even when they hung crooked, and set a casserole on our counter like she had always known where the potholders lived. They married under an arbor his mother would have loved, our granddaughter asleep in a white sweater during the toasts. If you'd asked me then to list the things I was certain of, I would have said the sun, gravity, and the fact that my son and I would always meet on Sundays for supper. Work never left me. I left it at the right time. I took the gold watch and the sheet cake, shook the hands that mattered, and came home to a yard that needed a stubborn man with a rake. Retirement did not mean idleness. It meant morning walks, repairs I used to postpone, and volunteering for the church fix-it days where you discover that mercy sometimes flows through a properly hung door dot. By then the portfolio had turned into something more than the weight of a file folder. The rentals, 4 in all, each one a lesson I could point to with a key paid for themselves and then paid for peace of mind. The brokerage statements looked like a story where the hero is compound interest and the villain is impatience. Cash. Accumulated not because I loved money, but because I loved options. I kept my truck. I patched my work jeans. If a neighbor needed a breaker swapped or a porch light wired, I showed up with my tool bag and refused payment except in cookies or conversation. I didn't advertise what the math said I was worth. People treat you differently when they think you can fix what money breaks. I wanted to see character, not choreography. My daughter didn't care about any of that. She called because she missed my voice and flew home when she could. A suitcase full of gifts that cost more thought than a cash. My son lived 20 minutes away and lived, as he liked to say, at a higher speed. Promotions, conferences, golf. The grandkids' calendars were as crowded as any executives. We adjusted. Sunday suppers sometimes became Sunday texts. I learned to send photos of the tomatoes I'd coaxed from the stingy soil. He learned to tap a heart and promised the next visit would be soon. When his mother died, the house went quiet in a way that rearranged the air itself. He stood steady beside me through the practical tasks, the funeral director's questions, the line of casseroles that appeared like clockwork, the thank you notes we wrote together at the kitchen table. Grief rearranged the furniture of faith, and routine but not the foundation. I filled the lonely spaces with small rituals and the small satisfactions of looking after what we had built on at some point after the headstone settled. The distance between my son and me widened in ways you only notice when you measure. A missed call here, a postponed lunch there. Work expanded to fill every available inch. When he did sit at my table, his eyes were elsewhere, not unkind, just elsewhere. He was still the man people described as golden, still telling stories. That sounded like success, still insisting everything was fine. I kept my counsel and kept my receipts. The properties stayed rented because I fixed what broke promptly and treated people as neighbors, not numbers. The accounts did what accounts do when they are fed and left in peace. I kept my will simple, split down the middle between my two children, with instructions that sounded like the father who raised them. Take care of one another, and if you can, leave something better than you found it. I believed proximity would carry us through whatever the future demanded. He was here, after all, the one close enough to borrow a ladder, close enough to swing by with milk if my knees were stiff. I told myself I wouldn't need much when age arrived, asking inconvenient questions. A ride to the clinic. A shelf moved to a lower cabinet. 20 minutes of conversation that made a long day shorter. What came next didn't happen all at once. It never does. But the first cracks in the picture everyone else admired began to show. And once you see them, you cannot pretend you haven't. That is where the story turns. Where Sunday supper becomes silence, where the man I raised begins. To choose a path I would never have imagined for him, and where another person, one with no obligation but plenty of heart, steps into the space he leaves behind. Harold. About 4 years ago, I started noticing changes in David's behavior. He was working longer hours, seemed stressed and distracted, and was increasingly short-tempered with Lisa and the kids. Harold. Lisa would confide in me during our Sunday dinners. She said David had been distant, that he was staying out late and being secretive about his activities. She suspected he was having an affair, but David denied it whenever she brought it up. Harold. I tried to talk to David about his marriage, to encourage him to work things out with Lisa. She was a good womankind, intelligent, and devoted to their children. But David would brush off my concerns, saying that Lisa was being paranoid, and that everything was fine. Harold. The truth came out in the worst possible way. Lisa discovered that David had been having an affair with his secretary, a woman 20 years younger than him. She found hotel receipts, text messages, and credit card charges that painted a clear picture of David's betrayal. Harold. When Lisa confronted David with the evidence, he didn't deny it. Instead, he told her that he'd fallen out of love with her and wanted a divorce. He said he was tired of being married to someone boring and wanted to start over with someone who understood him. Harold. The divorce was brutal. David hired an expensive lawyer and fought Lisa for everything: custody of the kids, the house, even her retirement savings. He claimed that since he was the primary breadwinner, he deserved the majority of their assets. Harold. Lisa was devastated. She'd been a stay-at-home mom for 15 years, and David was trying to leave her with nothing. She couldn't afford the kind of legal representation that David had, and it looked like she was going to lose everything. Harold. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I secretly hired Lisa the best divorce attorney in the state and paid all her legal fees. David never knew where Lisa got the money for her legal defense. Harold. With proper legal representation, Lisa was able to fight back against David's attempts to cheat her out of her fair share. The divorce proceedings revealed just how selfish and vindictive my son had become. Harold. David tried to hide assets, claimed that Lisa had contributed nothing to their marriage, and even attempted to get full custody of the children so he could reduce his child support payments. He showed no remorse for his affair and seemed to view the divorce as a business transaction. Harold. Meanwhile, Lisa conducted herself with dignity throughout the entire process. She never badmouthed David in front of the children, never tried to turn them against their father, and focused on protecting their interests rather than seeking revenge. Harold. The final settlement gave Lisa the house, half of David's retirement, savings and substantial alimony and child support payments. David was furious, claiming that Lisa had stolen his money and that the court system was biased against men. Harold. After the divorce, David's true character became even more apparent. He rarely saw his children, was constantly late with support payments, and seemed more interested in his new girlfriend than in maintaining a relationship with his kids. Harold. Lisa, on the other hand, threw herself into being the best single mother she could be. She went back to school to get her nursing degree, worked part-time while raising the children, and never complained about David's neglect of his parental responsibilities. Harold. I continued to have a relationship with both Lisa and the grandchildren. Lisa never tried to prevent me from seeing the kids, and she always treated me with respect and kindness. She was more of a daughter to me than my actual daughter, who rarely called or visited. Harold. David, however, started to change in his attitude toward me. He seemed resentful that I maintained a relationship with Lisa, and he began making comments about how I was taking sides in the divorce. The first sign was small enough to ignore if a man wanted to. David began arriving late to Sunday suppers that had once run on rails. He would text from the driveway to say he could not stay, or he would stand in the kitchen with his phone face up on the counter, glancing down the way a lifeguard scans a crowded pool for trouble only he can see. He ate fast, praised the roast, out of habit, and left earlier than dessert allowed. A pattern is just a habit with a calendar, and this one circled itself in red dot. Lisa filled the empty space without making a speech about it. She packaged leftovers the way Ruth used to do, labeled them with a date in tiny handwriting, and made sure the kids finished their homework at my table, while their father explained that quarter end at the office had a way of swallowing evenings. Oh, she apologized for him in little ways no one should have to, smiling too brightly when plans shifted, offering reasons that sounded like excuses because they were. The children noticed long before they had words to explain what they were. Noticing, my grandson started saving the best stories from his week for a father who kept missing the handoffs. My granddaughter set a plate aside on the counter and called it Dad's. And then a week later, she stopped setting the plate out before he arrived. When David did show, he was kind and distracted in equal measure. He listened with the look of a man waiting for a kettle to boil in another room. Work, he said, and the word carried everything. Promotions were possible. Clients were demanding. Travel had become necessary. He left early for flights and returned late with suit jackets that smelled like recycled air and hotel soap. The rituals that had tacked our family to the week began to fray. He skipped his son's Saturday morning soccer match because a conference call had migrated to the weekend. He promised a museum trip and then rescheduled it twice. He missed 2 dentist appointments for the kids in a row and shrugged off the fees as a cost of doing business. None of it was catastrophic. All of it accumulated. Lisa stayed steady as a lighthouse, rotating through tasks and tenderness. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor to shape algebra into something a 6th grader could hold. She pinned costume pieces for the school play, ran errands between nursing classes, and kept David looped in with texts that grew longer as his replies grew shorter. When Ruth was alive, She would have said that storms reveal construction. Lisa's beams held. One winter night, I drove over with a bag of citrus from the church pantry, the kind of delivery that gives a man an excuse to check the temperature of a home. The entryway smelled faintly of cologne that did not live there. There was a receipt wedged under a magnet on the refrigerator for a boutique hotel across town, the kind of place that charges for silence and the illusion of secrecy. The line for the room service gratuity was filled, a flourish in a hand I did not recognize. I put the oranges in a bowl and wished I had not seen what I had seen. The kids told me their father was going to the gym more, that he had a new routine, and better shoes and a playlist he would not let them change. A new shirt appeared in the hall closet, and then 3 more, all the kind that looked good in restaurant lighting. The credit card statement on the counter left there, while Lisa ran the change over a load of laundry, had charges that looked like late dinners and florist stops, clustered on days when David had claimed long meetings. I did not go looking for evidence. It lay on the surface like pollen in spring. Lisa began to talk around corners. She asked if I had ever worried about Ruth not coming home, and then laughed the question off before I could answer. She said she could not keep up with the laundry because the hamper seemed full of the wrong clothes at the wrong times. She said David had started keeping his phone in his pocket instead of leaving it on the counter. And the first time he did it, her heart sank for reasons she could not explain to herself. She told me she was tired and then caught herself and said she was fine. There was a night when David arrived at my door alone, later than late, and sat at the kitchen table without touching the coffee I poured. He talked about pressure and how success is not a single ladder but a web, and sometimes you step wrong. He said he felt observed in his own house. He said that Lisa did not understand what it took to keep a family afloat in a town where the currents shifted fast. He did not ask for advice. He asked for permission to keep his foot on the accelerator. I told him that marriages do not need heroes so much as they need presence. He nodded like a man who hears a fire alarm and decides. It rings for someone else. Spring arrived, and with it a softness that should have cheered everyone. Instead, a hardness set in. David was home less, and when he was home, he was elsewhere. The children learned to watch the driveway the way birders scan the sky. Lisa learned to keep the pantry stocked for 2 outcomes: dinner for 4 and dinner for 3. She stopped wearing her wedding band in the kitchen because the skin beneath it had turned raw from too much scrubbing and not enough lotion. She put it back on when she left the house. The truth finally presented itself the way truth often does, messy and indisputable. Lisa found a second phone in a gym bag that was not the gym bag David carried to the gym. It rang while she held it, buzzing with a caller ID that displayed a name she had seen in passing under a contented smile and a ponytail at the office Christmas party. There were messages in a tone that belongs to people who have mistaken novelty for intimacy. There were hotel confirmations in his email and a calendar entry that misnamed a client dinner. When she confronted him, he did not deny anything. He framed the affair as a discovery about himself, as if faithlessness were a seminar he had attended and found enlightening. He spoke about boredom as if it were a disease others gave him, and he was right to find medicine where he could. He proposed. A break that sounded like a bachelor's weekend extended to the horizon. The children were upstairs, the house was quiet, and a marriage that had taken years to form unspooled in less than an hour. Divorce slid into the conversation like a word they had practiced separately. He hired a lawyer whose advertisements make promises on billboards. He offered Lisa a monthly figure that would not cover groceries, and then he argued it was generous. He demanded to see financial records from a household he had not paid attention to in months. He suggested a custody schedule that treated the children like errands. He asked for the house as if it were an asset he could refinance emotions out of. Lisa did what resilient people do. She held on to dignity like a railing in a storm. She did not speak poorly of him to the children. She reminded them that love is not a zero-sum thing, even when adults behave as if it were. She booked appointments with financial counselors at the community center and studied into the night for exams that would get her the credentials to stand on her own feet. She cut coupons without shame and stretched meals with quiet skill. She began to answer the phone without hope that the man on the other end would be the one she married. The kids adapted the way kids do, with courage and question marks. My grandson started carrying a small notebook where he wrote down where he would be on which days, trying to impose order on a schedule that changed when it should not. My granddaughter packed and unpacked a backpack so many times that the zipper began to stutter. They asked if their father would be at the recital and then learned not to ask. When he did appear, they glowed like lamps lit from within and then dimmed to a steady blue when he left with the same speed he had arrived. I hovered at the edge of the fight because it was not mine to wage. I fixed a sagging cabinet door that preferred to stay ajar. I replaced a thermostat and showed the children how the numbers controlled the feel of a house. I became the ride that is always on time and the applause that never forgets its cue. Lisa thanked me in the way a person thanks water when their throat is dry. She did not ask for money. She asked for steady hands and a listening ear. The legal process made everything worse before it made anything better. Papers arrived by certified mail like weather alerts. A mediator sat with them at a laminate table and suggested compromise as if decency were a commodity they could split in half. Friends chose sides the way people do when they are frightened of being pulled into undertow. His work colleagues congratulated him on the new chapter he claimed to be opening. Her classmates in the nursing program offered childcare and notes from lectures she missed because a meeting ran long dot through all of it. One truth consolidated in my mind with the clarity of a breaker snapping into the on position. Lisa had not married my son for his potential. She had married him for the man he already was, the one who held babies at 2 a.m. and grilled burgers while laughing at burn buns. That man had been replaced by someone who optimized everything except honor. The arc from distracted husband to absentee father curved downward with awful predictability. The affair did not cause his character. It revealed it. When the decree finally arrived, it read like a ledger that could not possibly balance the accounts of the heart. There were numbers for support, percentages for retirement, weekends coded in alternating blocks. There were no lines for regret or gratitude or the years when life was simpler and everyone knew how to pass the mashed potatoes down the table without running into anyone's pride. By then, my own health had begun its slow negotiation with time. Knees muttered. Vision blurred at dusk. Steps down to the basement learned to creak louder than they used to. In a house with another story, this would be the moment when a son leans in, takes on a few of the small burdens, asks how he can make the road easier for the father who paved so much of it. Instead, he leaned away. He had a new house, a new plan, a life arranged with compartments that did not have room for mine. If you had told me years earlier that the woman who would stand in the gap would be the woman my son pushed out of his life, I might have called it irony. It was not. It was evidence. Lisa kept showing up long after she had any obligation to do so. She made sure I ate greens and saw the doctor and took my pills on time. She sat with me through ball games on TV and handed me tissues during the commercials. That catch older men off guard. She brought the children on the days David forgot, and on the days he remembered, but was too tired to walk through the door he had promised them. This was the season when a marriage finally admitted it had failed. Not because love is fragile, but because loyalty is. It was also the season when I took careful inventory, not of assets alone, but of actions. The ledger that would eventually decide where my life's work should go began to write itself, line by line, in the spaces my son abandoned and Lisa filled. Without being asked, Harold, 2 years ago, I started having health problems. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to make daily living more difficult. I had arthritis in my hands, my vision was getting worse, and I was having trouble maintaining my house and taking care of myself. Harold, I asked David if he could help me with some basic tasks: grocery shopping, doctor's appointments, minor repairs around the house. David's response was that he was too busy with work and his new relationship to be my caretaker. Harold, David suggested that I should consider moving to a senior living community or hiring a home health aide. When I mentioned that those options were expensive, David said, "Dad, you can't expect me to put my life on hold to take care of you. You need to figure out your own solutions." Harold. Lisa, on the other hand, stepped up without being asked. She started doing my grocery shopping, drove me to medical appointments, and even helped with household chores when she could. She never complained or made me feel like a burden. Harold, the contrast between David and Lisa's behavior was stark. Lisa, who had no legal or biological obligation to help me, was doing everything she could to make sure I was okay. David, my own son, couldn't be bothered to spend a few hours a week helping his aging father. Harold, my health continued to decline, and it became clear that I couldn't live independently much longer. I needed help with daily activities, medication, management, and basic safety. The question was what to do about it. Harold, I had several options. I could hire live-in help, which would cost about $5,000 a month, but would allow me to stay in my own home. I could move to an assisted living facility, which would cost about $3,000 a month and provide a social environment. Or I could move in with family, which would be the most affordable option. Harold, I hoped that David would offer to let me move in with him, or at least help me explore my options. Instead, he made the decision for me in the cruelest way possible. Harold, last Thanksgiving, David invited me to dinner at his new house with his girlfriend Stephanie. I was excited to spend the holiday with family and to meet the woman David was planning to marry. Harold, the dinner was awkward from the start. Stephanie was polite but cold, and David seemed nervous and distracted. When I asked about the grandchildren, David said they were spending Thanksgiving with Lisa's family and that it was complicated to coordinate schedules. Harold, after dinner, David said he wanted to talk to me privately. We went into his home office, and David closed the door. That's when he delivered the news that would change everything between us. Harold, David told me that he and Stephanie had been discussing my situation, and they decided that the best solution was for me to move into a nursing home. He said they'd already researched facilities and found one that would accept my Medicare and Social Security payments. Harold, I was shocked. I told David that I didn't need nursing home care yet, that I could still live independently with some help. I suggested that we explore other options: home health care, assisted living, or even me moving in with him temporarily. Harold, David's response was cold and final. He said, "Dad, Stephanie and I are starting our life together, and we can't have you living with us. You're becoming too much of a burden, and we need to think about our own future." Harold, I asked David if we could at least look at some assisted living facilities together, places that would give me more independence than a nursing home. But David had already made up his mind. Harold, he said, "I've already put a deposit down at Sunset Manor. They have a bed available next week, and I think it's the best solution for everyone. You'll have professional care, and Stephanie and I won't have to worry about you anymore." Harold, the way he said, "worry about you anymore," cut me to the bone. I realized that David didn't see me as his father who needed help. He saw me as a problem that needed to be solved. It started as small betrayals the body commits when it decides to renegotiate its contract. A jaw lid that would not yield to familiar torque. A knee that throbbed after a day on the ladder, even though the ladder had been traded for the garden years earlier. numbers on pill bottles that seemed smaller than they used to be, and a light in the hallway that felt dimmer. Though the bulb was new, I told myself it was age settling in like polite houseguests who would leave before the weekend. The houseguests stayed. Arthritis took my hands first. The electrician's grip that once twisted conduit and threaded fittings now complained, and the simple work of a doorknob. In the morning, the fingers unfurled slowly, as if each joint needed a separate invitation to wake. I learned new rituals. A bowl of warm water to soak away stiffness, a towel heated in the dryer to coax motion from reluctant knuckles, the small victory of buttoning a shirt on the first try. Pride recalibrated around tasks I had never thought. To celebrate, eyes followed the hands. The evening paper grew blurry at the edges, and the tape measure lines doubled if the light was wrong. My optometrist called it age-related changes. Nothing dramatic, but enough to turn stares into arithmetic. I stuck fluorescent tape on the leading edge of each step and installed a second handrail myself, inch by inch, pausing to breathe in a way that would have made the younger version of me laugh. Workmanship mattered, so did dignity. Sleep fractured. I woke at 2 and again at 4, lying still to listen for sounds a house makes when it worries about its owner. Blood pressure crept upward, and a harmless tremor arrived in my left hand like a moth that would not leave the porch light. The family doctor I had trusted for 30 years retired, and his replacement ordered a handful of new tests and spoke about baselines and gentle monitoring. He suggested physical therapy for the knee and a different anti-inflammatory for the hands. He recommended new shoes with a lift and asked about falls. I said there had been none. That was true until it was not that one afternoon I carried a box of winter clothes from the hall closet to the spare room and caught the corner of a rug with my toe. The fall was not dramatic, just a slow rolling surrender to gravity that left me on my side staring at dust bunnies and a penny from 1998. Nothing broke, but the shock of floor meeting bone at my age carried a lesson I could not ignore. I ordered 2 grab bars for the bathroom, a shower chair, and a non-slip mat with a texture like fine grit. I told no one about the bruise because, I knew exactly how fast stories about falls become decisions made by other people. I asked David for help in pieces that would not feel like obligations. A ride to the cardiologist because the bus line had changed schedules. An extra set of hands to carry the old window unit down to the garage before the first frost. A trip to the hardware store for salt when the driveway froze early. He suggested that a grocery delivery app could bring everything to my porch and that I might consider a handyman for the heavier work. He had meetings stacked end to end. He needed a weekend to recharge after a long week. He would call soon and we would put something on the calendar. Calendars have a way of revealing priorities without commentary. Lisa filled in the blanks, without being asked and without keeping a ledger. She rearranged her nursing clinicals to drive me to appointments and sat taking notes. While a physician assistant discussed medication interactions, I can now recite in my sleep. She stood in my kitchen and relabeled pill organizers with neat block letters when the manufacturer changed the tablet color and confused me. She brought a blood pressure cuff and showed me how to log readings morning and night, then texted the numbers to my doctor's office when the systolic spiked for 3 days in a row. When the tremor made soup slosh from the pot to the burner, she bought lighter pans and laughed with me as we learned which grip kept liquid where it belonged. She never treated me like a task. The grandchildren adapted the grace notes of caregiving into games. My grandson made a competition out of finding low-sodium options I would not despise, awarding himself points for each label under a certain threshold. My granddaughter taped reminder notes beneath light switches and on the inside of cabinet doors, cheerful little flags that kept me from bending farther than was wise. Their presence turned work into companionship. My son's absence turned silence into its own kind of noise. I took stock of the home with a journeyman's eye and admitted what needed adjusting. I lowered the water heater temperature, installed lever handles where knobs had lived for decades, and raised the dishwasher on blocks so loading did not require a prayer to my lower back. I sharpened pencils and updated the list taped inside. The pantry door that told anyone who needed to know where to find shutoffs, flashlights, spare batteries, and the key to the shed. It comforted me that the house still ran on systems I understood, even if my knees did not dot bills remain paid on time, not because I feared late fees, but because order felt like a small resistance against decline. I set repeating reminders on the old flip phone Lisa insisted I replace, and then kept the flip phone because the children loved it. I still could balance a checkbook faster than most people can open an app. The numbers stayed crisp, even as the fingers typing them did not. Independence became a series of small proofs offered to an audience of one. There were good days. It is important to say that. Days when the pain relented, and I walked to the park 2 blocks over and sat on a bench counting dogs by breed. Days when the hands loosened their grip on stiffness and I sanded and oiled the maple cutting board Ruth used for decades, the smell of mineral oil lifting memories like steam. I learned the trick of pacing one larger chore in the morning, a rest after lunch, an easy task in the late afternoon when the light softened and the ache returned. There were also days that felt like rehearsals for a future I did not want. The night the furnace hiccuped and I could not get the access panel off without calling a neighbor. The morning I dropped my house keys on the driveway and needed 3 tries to pick them up with gloves on. The week a sinus infection slid into my chest, and I learned, again, how quickly strength drains at my age and how long it takes to fill the reservoir back up. Each episode argued for more help, and each recovery tempted me to pretend I had imagined. The need cost sharpened the conversation I had with myself. A home health aide a few hours a day would be manageable and preserve dignity, but the agencies were backed up, and the hourly rate had crept into a bracket that makes a man think twice even when he can pay. Assisted living would offer community, and 3 meals and a call bell that summoned someone with training, but the price tag nodded toward the idea that security is a luxury. Live-in help would keep me in my chair by the bay window in the afternoons where the light sits kindly, but live-in help is a profession in short supply, and the logistics run on a different kind of stamina than I had to give. I did the math 6 different ways and arrived at the same conclusion each time. The decision should be mine, and there was no urgent reason to surrender it yet. I revisited paperwork because that is what a responsible man does when the body begins to whisper about timelines, healthcare proxy, advance directive, power of attorney sitting in a folder labeled for when. I did not sign anything new that would hand over the keys to the present. I made sure the people who had earned my trust knew where the documents lived and what they said. I left room for mercy and clarity in equal measure. David's responses grew stranger as the months pressed on. He asked about the cost of repairs before asking whether repairs were needed. He spoke about burden the way an actuary speaks about risk pools. He said friends of his had found excellent solutions for their aging parents. As if I were a spreadsheet line he could optimize. He apologized for missing yet another appointment and then explained how complicated things were at work and at home, as if the apology were a debit that cleared the account. I learned to recognize the particular tone a man uses when he wants you to agree with him, so he will not have to bear the embarrassment of insisting. Lisa never used the word burden and never made me feel like a project. She invented small traditions that made support feel like continuity instead of charity. Friday grocery runs together with the list written in pencil. A stop at the bakery for a loaf, still warm. The shared satisfaction of putting cans in the pantry facing forward because that was the rule Ruth set and I have never broken. On clinic days, we turned the waiting room into a classroom where she quizzed herself with flashcards and I judged the seriousness of other patients. Conditions based on the thickness of their chart printouts. Humor did not fix anything. It made space around the problem so we could breathe. The fall turned to winter again, and the driveway glistened in the wrong ways. I salted early and often, and still went down once, this time in front of a neighbor who hurried over and offered a hand that felt like a lifeline and a reminder. He suggested calling my son. I thanked him and changed the subject. No one wants to admit that pride and prudence are often in conflict, or that the person who should be your first call is not even on your list. By the time daffodils punched through the mulch in the churchyard, I had accepted a truth I did not say out loud. I could keep myself upright most days, but the margin for error had thinned, and decisions made in a rush by other people could erase choices I had protected carefully. I needed a plan for help that kept me in my life, not parked beside it. I believed there was time to shape that plan gently, with the help of the people who had shown up and the resources I had built quietly across decades. I underestimated how quickly a decision can be taken out of a man's hands when someone else decides expedience is kinder than patience. The next chapter arrived not as a conversation, but as a conclusion presented to me fully formed. That, more than any ache or pill or grab bar, is what made my health feel as though it had truly declined. Not that the body demanded assistance, but that another man presumed to define what assistance must look like and when it must begin. Harold. David drove me to Sunset Manor the following Tuesday. It was a decent facility, not the worst place I could have ended up, but it wasn't home. David helped me move my few belongings into a small room that I'd be sharing with another resident. Harold. As David was leaving, he promised to visit me every week and to bring the grandchildren to see me regularly. He said this was just a temporary arrangement until we could figure out something better. Harold, that was 3 years ago. David has visited me exactly twice, once about a month after I moved in, and once last Christmas when he stayed for 20 minutes and seemed eager to leave. Harold, the grandchildren have never visited. When I asked David about them during our rare phone calls, he says they're busy with school and activities. I suspect he's never even told them where I am. Harold. Lisa, however, has been a constant presence in my life. She visits me every 2 weeks, brings me books and treats, and always updates me on how the children are doing. She's brought the grandkids to see me several times, and they always seem happy to spend time with their grandfather. Harold. Lisa never complains about David's absence or tries to turn me against him. She just quietly fills the void that my son left behind. She's shown me more love and respect in the past 3 years than David has shown me since his divorce. Harold. Living in the nursing home has given me a lot of time to think about my life, my relationships, and what really matters. I've watched other residents whose children visit regularly, and I've seen the joy it brings them. I've also seen residents like me, whose families have essentially abandoned them. Harold. The staff at Sunset Manor is kind and professional, but it's not the same as having family who cares about you. I've spent countless hours wondering what I did wrong as a father, how I failed to raise a son who would abandon his father in his time of need. The first night at Sunset Manor taught me more about humility than any sermon ever managed. A curtain divided the room into halves as if dignity could be measured in fabric yards. On my side sat a narrow bed, a wardrobe no wider than my shoulders, and a chair with arms that creaked in a language only old wood speaks. On the other side, a television murmured about a game I could not see over the curtain, and a man named Earl breathed in the tempo of freight trains. I lined my toothbrush and razor in a straight row on the tiny sink shelf and told myself order is a kind of courage. Institutions run on clocks. Breakfast at 7:30, medication rounds at 8, vital signs at 9, exercises at 10, lunch at noon, A stretch of afternoon that must be filled with something or it fills you with nothing. Supper at 5, lights dimming by 8. At home, I used to set my day by the hum of the refrigerator and the sun angle on the living room rug. At Sunset Manor, the day moved on wheels and clipboards. I learned the rhythm and, where I could, nudged it. I asked to take my blood pressure. After a few deep breaths, instead of right after the walk from the dining room, and the nurse smiled like I had told a joke, only she appreciated. I kept my hands busy to keep my mind from grinding its gears. The maintenance fellow, Marco, noticed me staring at the breaker panel one morning and asked if I knew anything about electrical. I gave him the kind of look a journeyman saves for apprentices and then apologized in case it came off sharp. We ended up spending an hour tracing which breakers fed which outlets, labeling them with a label maker that stuck like stubborn memories. I did not touch a wire rules, but I pointed and explained load balance and why the microwave and space heater should never share a circuit. After that, he would stop by when he had a puzzle. It was not work. It was something better, usefulness. Earl turned out to be a retired machinist with a cough that sounded like a loose fitting. He had a son who visited every Sunday and a daughter who sent postcards, even though she lived 3 miles away and could have come herself. He snored like a bear, but apologized every morning. When he coughed at night, I timed his breaths the way I used to time current draw on a motor and press the call light if the pattern shifted. He kept peppermints in his nightstand and slid one across the table at lights out like a contraband deal. It is hard to feel invisible when someone passes you a peppermint as if you share a secret. Staff made the place livable. Ms. Darlene on the night shift tucked blankets, like she was tucking in the idea that men our age still deserve comfort. Tyrone on days called everyone sir and ma'am without a trace of sarcasm, a habit he said he learned from his grandmother and never set down. May, the occupational therapist, taught me tricks that saved my pride. A loop of twine on my zipper, a rubber mat under the cutting board, a reacher tool I had mocked in catalogs until I watched her pick a dropped sock off the floor with the elegance of a magician. I wrote their names on a notepad and kept track of who liked oatmeal with raisins and who took their coffee black because gratitude belongs in specifics. The dining room is where the truth of a place lives. Some residents measured the day by dessert, some by the chair they claimed by the window, some by the number of bites they could coax from hands that had forgotten the choreography of fork to mouth. I claimed a seat near the door so I could watch entrances and exits, the small dramas of visitors and the quiet collapses when no one came. You learn to tell the difference between a daughter's late apology and a son's careful lie. You learn that birthdays in these places feel both tender and too bright. Lisa arrived every other Saturday with a tote bag that violated no policy and yet seemed to restore a dozen small freedoms. Books I wanted to read with the font not too proud of itself. A thermos of soup seasoned the way I like, with pepper flirting at the top. New socks with the kind of elastic that respects a man's calves. She brought pictures the grandchildren drew. A truck with wheels too big for physics. A house with windows smiling like mouths. A stick figure with a mustache taller than his head that was, I am told me. Sometimes she brought the children, and the room swelled to fit their questions. Do the wheels on your walker spin like race car wheels? Why is the nurse station a square? Can we press the elevator button even if we're not going anywhere? I said yes to the elevator button, and the world did not end. David came twice in 3 years. The first time he stood with his hands in his coat pockets, like he was afraid if he took them out he might touch something that would claim him. He asked if I needed anything, and I told him socks because it was easier than telling him what I needed. He nodded, promised, and left with the echo of a busy man in a hallway designed to carry sound. The second visit, he kept glancing at his phone, and when it buzzed, he said he had to take it because it was important. I told him we can recognize important, even from here. He did not stay long, Afterward, Miss Darlene brought me an extra pudding cup and set it on my tray without comment. Mercy often looks like an extra pudding. I built a life inside the regiment. After breakfast, I walked laps in the corridor, counting ceiling tiles instead of steps because my knees preferred ceilings to numbers. At 11, I did hand exercises with a rubber band that felt like bargaining with stubborn fingers. In the afternoons, I claimed the corner of the activity room nearest the window and repaired what could be repaired within policy: a wobbly chess piece with a dot of wood glue, the loose hinge on the birdhouse used for spring crafts, a pair of reading glasses resurrected with a screw the size of Patience. On Sundays, I wrote letters on paper to people who had forgotten their handwriting and mailed them to myself, because the surprise of receiving your own words at a later date is a kind of companionship. Sunset Manor had its share of sorrows. Mr. Alvarez down the hall forgot his wife's name every Tuesday and remembered it every Friday, and both days wrecked him in different ways. Mrs. Keegan waited by the fish tank for her son who scheduled his guilt like a quarterly meeting and skipped more often than not. You learn to soften your eyes so other people can grieve without feeling watched. You learn to look straight at joy when it walks in, because joy, too, gets nervous in places like this and needs encouragement to stay. I kept my mind from rusting by running numbers on paper napkins. If a man lives on a fixed schedule, what variables remain worth optimizing? I charted blood pressure against soup days versus sandwich days and decided the sodium conversation would never end. I tracked pain against weather fronts and discovered that my knee knows more meteorology than the evening news. I proved to myself that even with a clipped horizon, pattern recognition still feels like a superpower. When Earl's daughter convinced him to transfer to a facility closer to her, his side of the curtain became an empty stage. For a week, I slept like a man waiting for the other shoe to snore. Then a new roommate arrived, a former trumpet player named Walt, who could still pucker a scale with no horn in his hands. He taught me how to whistle properly, and I taught him how to fold a fitted sheet, which is to say, I taught him how to accept a truce with cloth. We were, briefly, good for each other. When he passed in his sleep one windy night, the staff handled the logistics with reverence you cannot put in a policy manual. I wrote his daughter a letter about the way he grinned when a nurse called him maestro. I did not write about the quiet afterward. Some truths belong to the room. Money stayed a rumor here, and I kept it that way. I paid my bills, tipped where tipping is allowed, and sent anonymous contributions to the staff fund that covered emergency scrubs and gas cards. I declined the private room because I wanted to be stubborn about the idea that comfort should not be purchased where decency ought to suffice. Besides, a curtain teaches patience, and patience is a muscle you need in a place where your name is on a schedule. The administrator once asked me to speak at a family orientation about how to make the transition easier on elders. I said bring real photos, not screen swipes. Label drawers with words, not just the memory of what used to be in them. Do not say we when you mean you should. And visit on random Wednesdays, not just on holidays when your conscience requires a parade. Some people took notes. Some looked at their watches. That is the ratio everywhere. As the months turned into years, I understood that abandonment calcifies. If you let it, but it can also be carved around, like wood reshaped to hold a new purpose. The routine no longer felt like a cage, but a scaffold, something I could climb when the day sagged. I knew which staff to ask for help with which problems, which resident would swap fruit cups for Jell-O, which volunteer had a singing voice suited for hymns, and which for Sinatra. Small maps, well memorized, make any territory more survivable. I also learned that silence is not neutral. The absence of a son at your door speaks as loudly as a knock. I saved the visitor logs the front desk printed when I asked. An accountant's instinct turned into an old man's archive. I kept a calendar with initials on days people came so I could look back and tell the truth about who showed up. It was not spite, It was a record. Records matter when memories blur and stories begin to argue with facts. On good days, I wheeled to the courtyard and sat by the maple that drops its leaves like a slow, polite applause each fall. On bad days, I pressed the call button and practiced the sentence, "Thank you for helping me," until I could say it without swallowing pride that had no business standing in the way. Most days were in between, the ordinary kind that make a life even in a place built for endings. Through all of it, Lisa kept arriving with her tote bag and her steady voice, and the children grew taller against the doorframe the staff marked for them with pencil, a borrowed tradition that made them feel claimed. The contrast between the family I had and the family I was supposed to have became impossible to ignore, even for a man trained to keep his feelings behind weathered hands. Living at Sunset Manor did not break me. It clarified me. It took away the noise and left a signal. Who showed up? Who didn't? What mattered when most of what used to matter had been reduced to a drawer and a chair and a schedule? And when it came time to decide what story my estate would tell after I was gone, the evidence of these Hall's visitor logs, grocery lists, peppermint tributes, penciled door frames, spoke more plainly than any argument my son could someday make. Harold, 6 months ago, I made a decision that would have shocked David if he'd been paying attention to my life. I called my lawyer, James Patterson, and asked him to come to the nursing home to discuss updating my will. Harold, James had been handling my legal affairs for 20 years, and he knew about my financial situation. He was surprised to learn that David had put me in a nursing home, especially since I could easily afford better care. Harold, I told James that I wanted to make some significant changes to my estate planning. My original will had left everything to David and Sarah equally, with small bequests to the grandchildren. But David's abandonment had changed my perspective on who deserved to inherit my life's work. Harold, I instructed James to rewrite my will, leaving the majority of my estate to Lisa. She would receive my house, my rental properties, and most of my investment portfolio. The grandchildren would each receive substantial trust funds for their education and future needs. Harold, David would receive exactly what he'd given me in my time of need nothing. Harold, James tried to talk me out of such a drastic change. He said that family relationships are complicated and that David might come around eventually. But I'd had 3 years to think about this decision, and my mind was made up. Harold, I told James, David made his choice when he dropped me off here and forgot about me. He decided that I was a burden not worth his time or attention. Now he can live with the consequences of that choice. Harold, the new will was legally airtight. James made sure that David couldn't contest it successfully, and we included detailed documentation of David's abandonment and Lisa's care for me over the years. Harold, I also wrote a letter to be read after my death, explaining my decision to leave everything to Lisa. I wanted David to understand exactly why he was being disinherited and what his abandonment had cost him. Harold, last month, I decided it was time to let David know about the changes to my will. I didn't want him to find out after my death. I wanted him to understand the consequences of his actions while I was still alive to see his reaction. Harold, I had James call David and request a meeting to discuss my estate planning. David was initially reluctant, saying he was too busy, but James insisted it was important and time-sensitive. Harold, David came to the nursing home on a Saturday afternoon looking annoyed and impatient. He clearly wanted to get the meeting over with as quickly as possible. James was there with all the legal documents, and I was prepared for the most important conversation of my life. Harold, James started by explaining that I'd made significant changes to my will and that David needed to be informed of these changes. David seemed bored at first, probably assuming that the changes were minor adjustments. Harold, then James dropped the bombshell. He told David that the majority of my estate, worth approximately $3.2 million, would be going to Lisa, not to him. David's face went white as James explained the details of the new will. Harold. David's first reaction was disbelief. He said, "That's impossible. Dad doesn't have that kind of money. He's just an electrician living in a nursing home." James calmly showed David the documentation of my assets, the properties, the investments, the bank accounts. Harold. As the reality sank in, David's disbelief turned to anger. He started yelling at me, accusing me of being senile, of being manipulated by Lisa, of making decisions I wasn't competent to make. Harold. I let David rant for a few minutes. Then I calmly asked him a simple question. "When was the last time you visited me, son?" David stopped yelling and looked confused. I continued, "When was the last time you called to check on me? When was the last time you brought my grandchildren to see me?" Harold. David couldn't answer because he knew the truth. He'd abandoned me completely, and now he was angry that his abandonment had consequences. Harold. I told David, "You said I was too much of a burden for you to handle. You dropped me off here 3 years ago and forgot I existed. Lisa has been more of a child to me than you have. She visits me, cares about my well-being, and treats me with the respect you never showed." Harold. David tried to argue that he'd been busy, that work and his new relationship had kept him occupied, but I cut him off. I said, "David, you made a choice. You chose your convenience over your father. Now I'm making a choice too." Harold. James explained that the will was legally binding and that David's chances of successfully contesting it were virtually zero. The documentation of his abandonment and Lisa's care was overwhelming. Harold. David stormed out of the nursing home that day, threatening to fight the will and claiming that I'd lost my mind. But I knew he was just angry that his plan to inherit my money while ignoring me had backfired. Harold. Word of my decision spread quickly through the family. My daughter Sarah called me from California, shocked to learn about both my wealth and David's behavior. She said she had no idea that David had been neglecting me so completely. Harold. Sarah supported my decision to change the will. She said, "Dad, if David couldn't be bothered to visit you or care about your well-being, then he doesn't deserve to benefit from your life's work." Harold. Lisa was overwhelmed when I told her about the inheritance. She tried to refuse it, saying that she'd care for me because she loved me, not because she expected anything in return. But that's exactly why she deserved it. Harold. I told Lisa, "You've been more of a daughter to me than my own son has been a son. You've shown me kindness, respect, and love when David showed me nothing but neglect. This money will ensure that you and my grandchildren are taken care of, and that's what I want." Harold. David has tried to reconcile with me several times since learning about the will change. Suddenly, he has time to visit, wants to bring the grandchildren to see me, and claims that he's sorry for neglecting me. Harold. But it's too late. David's newfound attention is motivated by money, not love. He had 3 years to show me that he cared, and he chose not to. I'm not going to reward his greed by pretending that his sudden interest in my well-being is genuine. Harold. The will remains unchanged. Lisa will inherit the house where she can raise my grandchildren, the rental properties that will provide her with financial security, and the investments that will ensure she never has to worry about money again. Harold. I'm 81 years old now, and I don't have many years left. But I'm at peace with my decision to disinherit David and leave everything to Lisa. She earned it through her actions, her kindness, and her loyalty. Harold. David taught me a painful but important lesson about family. Blood doesn't automatically make someone family actions do. Lisa has been more family to me in the past 5 years than David has been since his divorce. Harold. Some people might think I'm being too harsh, that I should forgive David and give him another chance. But abandoning your elderly father isn't a mistake. It's a choice, and choices have consequences. Harold. David chose his convenience over his father's well-being. He chose his new girlfriend over his family obligations. He chose to see me as a burden rather than as the man who raised him and provided for him his entire life. Harold, now he'll have to live with the consequences of those choices. While Lisa and my grandchildren benefit from my life's work, David will get exactly what he gave me nothing. Harold, I sleep well at night knowing that my money will go to someone who actually deserves it. Lisa will use it to provide for my grandchildren, to secure their education, and to build the kind of life that David tried to deny her during their divorce. Harold, as for David, you'll learn too late that abandoning your parents doesn't just hurt them, it costs you everything you thought you'd inherit. The son who called me a burden will discover that the real burden is living with the knowledge that his greed and selfishness cost him millions. Harold, they say you can't take it with you when you die, but you can choose who gets it. And I've chosen to give it to the person who treated me like family when my own son treated me like garbage. Harold, David wanted me out of his life. Soon, he'll get his wish permanently. But he'll spend the rest of his life knowing that his abandonment of his father was the most expensive mistake he ever made.